introduced into the sessions at the upcoming National Conference on Landscape Restoration Scaling Up that will be convened virtually from the 9th to the 12th of July. And that conference, we hope everyone participating in this webinar will be able to join us as well. At the end of the seminar, we'll display some details for registering for that event so that you can get engaged. My name is Dennis Garrity, Nairobi resident and former Director General of ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Center. Currently, I chair the board of the Global Evergreening Alliance, whose mission is the massive scaling up of restoration around the world. The Alliance has now over 50 member organizations, including development and conservation NGOs and research institutions. We are spearheading the Evergreening the Earth campaign, about which you'll hear more just a little later. May I have the next slide, please? There we go. So today's program is organized as follows. First, Bob Winterbottom will be setting the stage for us by sharing his reflections on challenges and needs for training and capacity building in support of land restoration, based on a career spanning many decades in the developing world. Then Zanel Nguru will be giving us the results. Will be giving us the results of an initial survey that's been conducted to give feedback on the status of capacity building for restoration in Kenya. Following her presentation, we'll have two panel discussions. The first will enable a number of colleagues from diverse organizations to react to the survey tool and its results. And the second panel will focus on the challenges faced in building effective capacity for accelerated scaling within and among organizations in Kenya, and how together we can address those challenges. Finally, we will wind up with an open question and answer with audience participation. And for that, please do use the chat box during the webinar to jot down your questions and comments, as we'll be addressing those in the course of those discussions. Kenya has made a national commitment to restore 5.1 million hectares of degraded land during the next decade: agricultural land, forest land, and rangelands. Kenya can lead the way in Africa by building the solidarity and partnerships that enable all committed organizations to get gainfully engaged in restoration and truly build a restoration movement at the national level. Ultimately, capacity will be the limiting factor, as we see that investment in restoration and carbon credits is now bound to advance by leaps and bounds over the coming years, because of the enormous new interest in restoration and concern about land degradation in Kenya and all around the world. Well, let's now hear more about this from Bob Winterbottom, Evergreening Alliance Fellow and formerly a senior leader based at the World Resources Institute. In that capacity, Bob was instrumental in launching the Africa 100 initiative to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land across Africa. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis. And good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be with you today. And as Dennis has just said, I wanted to share some thoughts about challenges and needs with respect to capacity building and training. This helps provide, I think, a little context for the information about the survey that you'll hear in a minute from Zanele. And I hope it provides some some thought for further reflection by the panelists, and I look forward to their suggestions and comments. So as Dennis has just said, we're working with the Global Evergreening Alliance and all of its partners. And our main aim is to foster some collaboration, learning, sharing, harmonization across institutions in a way that we can really support scaling up locally generated long-term abundance movements. Abundance movements in the sense that enable farmers, rural communities to prosper and to accomplish unprecedented outcomes. So in terms of carbon sequestration and dealing with the climate crisis that we hear about now on a daily basis, our ambition is to help all of us working together to capture 20 billion tons of carbon every year by 2050. And we do think this can be done. There's a white paper if you go to the website of the Global Evergreening Alliance or the Evergreening the Earth campaign that Dennis alluded to. It outlines how this can be done. But basically, it's all about increasing tree and shrub cover on farmlands, sequestering more carbon in soils, increasing biomass energy production, restoring degraded forest lands, which of course is a focus of the upcoming conference, and also suppressing fires and regenerating pasture lands. So there's specific numerical targets. And again, I hope you can look at the white paper and find more information on the website. But increasing tree cover on farmlands can capture 2.5 billion tons of carbon per year. And particularly if we are able to scale up practices like farmer managed natural regeneration, other agroforestry practices. And we know that there's many opportunities also to sequester more carbon in soil. And leguminous shrubs on farms that could capture another 2.5 billion tons of carbon. And energy production could help us to capture more carbon through the use of fast growing shrubs like Glaricidia and others. And then restoring forest land, there's possibility a target that we're setting and we think can be achieved of restoring 575 million hectares globally and 650 million hectares of pasture lands. So the why and the how is all about, we know now that land degradation has negative impacts on food production, on climate resilience, on biodiversity, on the livelihoods of millions of people. And we know a lot about the causes of land degradation, whether it's deforestation, grazing management, and other inappropriate or unsustainable practices. But the most important thing that we have learned, I think, is that farmers and rural communities can change their behaviors and adopt improved land management and evergreening practices on a massive scale, because it would be in their best interest, their best interest. They would be more food secure and have many improvements in there. So it's a question of how can we leverage these potential improvements and accelerate the changes. And as we've thought about this, developed strategies, it keeps coming back to the issue of training and capacity building. Because whether it's short-term objectives of trying to increase access to knowledge or improving skills or strengthening institutions, mobilizing communities, movement building, accelerated learning, or sort of intermediate objectives of changes in mindsets and behaviors, we want to achieve, that's the way and the door and the portal through which we can move to achieve these longer term goals of reduced degradation across the landscapes and accelerated and widespread progress in restoration, and having these large scale impacts and success over large areas and achieving these very ambitious targets that I just presented to you, that I just shared with you. And that at the end of the day would really be transformational in terms of socioeconomic and environmental outcomes that we're able to achieve. So next slide. What are some of these main challenges that we've talked about? Well, as Dennis alluded, we have programs like Africa 100 and the Great Green Wall and many others, the Bond Challenge, with many pledges to restore. So there's political will, there's commitments there to restore over 100 million hectares just in Africa. But we know that implementation is lagging. The Great Green Wall is working at the level of about maybe 1 million hectares a year for the past 10 years. And so that's another 90 years before they reach the target of 100 million hectares. So continued progress is, if it's only a matter of hundred thousands of hectares a year when we need to do tens of millions, our progress is just not going to, it's going to be overtaken. We know there's serious questions of worsening climate change, conflicts, there's population growth. So we really have to massively accelerate on the ground implementation. How can we do that? That's a big challenge, is to really scale up implementation. And again, people often say, well, if we had more financing, if we could increase investment in the public agencies, if we could leverage different investments through the private sector, if we can mobilize youth, women, if we can develop scaling up strategy. There's a publication about that from WRI that you may be familiar with. But a big point that often gets alluded to again is to improve coordination and to increase support for training and capacity building. It keeps coming back to that, I think. So we do know about what works, why, and how to accelerate landscape restoration, which is really an imperative. Some of you may have seen the Restoring Africa Drylands. If you just Google that, it's a Tropenbos publication. There's many of your colleagues have written articles about success in Kenya and around the Horn of Africa, across the Sahel and West Africa and Southern Africa. There's the FMNR Hub, hosted by World Vision Australia, where you can find a lot of information about farmer-managed natural regeneration. There's, of course, ICRAF literature and online courses and evergreening practices. This WRI publication about what do we do to be more successful in scaling up regreening. So all of these different publications and documented case studies and so on, they point out to the importance of stock taking or sort of figuring out what communities have already learned and how we can leverage that. They talk about increasing cross visits, peer-to-peer, hands-on practical training. They have a lot to say about the types of training that are most effective, about knowledge platforms that could help inform and scale up communications, which is a big important element of the strategy to accelerate implementation, and supporting community-based institutions, developing local conventions or strengthening local bylaws and so on. Other institutional reforms, including rethinking the training and redoing and improving training for professionals, whether they be forestry, agriculture, or other sectors. So we do have this thought about evergreen academies. Now we're really talking about virtual hubs or collaborative platforms for sharing these training practices. But the idea is to support curriculum development that would fill some of these gaps. And we can hear about those from you and others, I think, to conduct these training programs. They just need to be multiplied and expanded and supported to a greater degree. Webinars, seminars, all modes of training, but targeting the key things that are needed to scale up and accelerate the scaling of these very effective evergreen practices. And promoting hands-on training and fostering the engagement of NGOs and governments, and developing these decentralized platforms so we have more collaboration and the support is developed to achieve these goals, these very ambitious goals. Next slide. So these are some of the possible target areas that as a suggestion, you can consider them. One would be to promote the use of the survey, that the types of survey and training needs assessments, these easily tools that it can be online using Google Forms. You'll hear about that in a moment, but that could help us to really zero in on what are the gaps and what are the priority needs. Another important area could be to think about how can we really ensure the full participation of local communities, both in developing and implementing these training programs. So they're going to be very sort of rooted on the ground, practical, cost-effective, incorporating local knowledge and so on. We also can think about how we can leverage needed changes and additions to existing curricula. We know that there's a lot of institutions out there, training, academic, educational institutions, but maybe they just haven't yet incorporated a class on the concept of FMNR in their curriculum and need to. There's a lot that can be done to organize communities to do peer-to-peer training, and to, again, rethink the roles and the contributions of these different services, be they agriculture, forestry, I hope we'll hear from them, environmental services, and others. And finally, it's all about really not only improving skills, but helping to shift mindsets so that we can, this is another challenging area, Dennis and others could elaborate on it, how we need to, if we're going to be thinking about restoring pasture lands, forests, and across the landscapes, engaging more with herders and pastoralists and others. Next. So I think we really do look forward, as I say, to your collaboration on these training activities with the Alliance, and to your suggestions in this webinar and in uh, the, uh, the conference that's going to be coming up. And so I won't elaborate on the ones, but again, these are kind of a recap of some of the ideas that we just have been sharing with you. Improving the use of this survey that Zenelli is about to talk about, increasing our collaboration and capitalizing on these opportunities that are out there. Again, thanks very much. I hope that was understandable and helpful.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. A great overview of what we're really about in accelerating landscape restoration far beyond what has ever been achieved before. You know, I think it was a perfect way to set the stage. And now I'd like to turn to Ms. Zenelli Nguru. Zenelli is working with the Regreening Africa project that is scaling up evergreening restoration practices to 1 million hectares and 500,000 households in Kenya and 7 other African countries. Zenelli will be sharing the initial results of a survey to develop a greater understanding of the capacity building efforts of organizations leading to restoration in Kenya. Zenelli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And so as Dennis has mentioned, I'll be presenting the results from the survey of Marion. Please just go back and look this over. Yes, the survey of training resources and capacity building needs for landscape restoration. Next slide, please. So basically the aim of the survey, it's a survey of training resources and capacity building needs for landscape restoration, which was developed by the Global Evergreening Alliance. Together with myself, Bob, we've been able to work with other institutions and organizations to really come up with a survey that could help us understand the capacity building needs, as well as the training needs that exist globally. And then the Alliance seeks to address evergreening training needs by leveraging and disseminating existing training materials, as well as help fill the gaps and meet training needs by increasing support for capacity building activities. And as Bob mentioned, really with this survey, we hope to know what is on the ground, where the needs are, and how we can really come together and work together and create a community of organizations that are really trying to achieve one goal of restoration. So the survey is basically divided into 3 parts, and part 1 of this survey is focused on the questions on training materials and how they are used. And basically this is what will be presented in this presentation of the results. Part 2 of the survey, which you can undertake or you can respond to after you have responded to part 1, really looks at existing gaps that exist in relation to the training needs, the types of materials, training materials, capacity building activities, and other pathways that are recommended to meet the training and capacity building needs. So depending on what you as your organization see works well for you, you can recommend it on part 2, and then we can adopt it as the other organizations. And then it also seeks to see the types of program interventions that have been particularly useful and effective in scaling up landscape restoration. And as you know that there are different interventions, and some might work for you, but not work for others. But it's worth us and knowing them and trying them and seeing if they work for us also, or whether we can improve on them. And then part 3 of the survey really looks at evolving context for training and capacity building for landscape restoration. And this is whereby you want to seek additional information that can be provided to improve the understanding of context and needs for training to accelerate the widespread adoption of evergreening practices. We know that we are living in different times, and times keep on changing. Different interventions that worked yesterday might not work today. So we're trying to keep ourselves updated and see what is happening today that might have not happened or worked yesterday. So basically, as we all know, we're living in COVID-19 times. The way we used to train before COVID might not work right now because of lockdown and things like that. So we need to seek other interventions. And this is where we try to get the materials or the information that can help us to evolve really with the times. And then, so as I had mentioned, the results that will be shared during these presentations are only for part one of the survey, where we really did a pilot and 15 organizations participated in this survey. We have representation from a number of institutions that you can see, quite representing the whole organizations really or sector in Kenya. We have CBOs where we have One Vision who has taken part. We have government parastatals, we have the Ministry of Agriculture. We also have academic institutions where you see Sena University. So it's really quite well represented. And in these results, you will see the views of all of these institutions. Next slide, please. So on to the questions we were asking in the survey. So the first question that we wanted to find out is, what have been the main objectives of the training activities related to evergreening and landscape restoration supported by your organization? And as you can see, we had quite a long list of objectives that these organizations are looking at as their training. But the top three that I want to highlight in this slide are that were mentioned as their top objectives that they look at are: one, to reduce deforestation and increase tree cover. And then the second one, we have reduce rural poverty and increase rural incomes. We have the third one, reduce vulnerability and increase resilience of climate change. So these are the top three objectives that mainly are there, that are mainly for their training activities. And as you can see, we have 15 of the representatives mentioning that they train to reduce deforestation and increase tree cover, which is part of the initiatives really that the government of Kenya seeks to achieve with the 10% tree cover. Please move on to the next slide, Mary. So the next question that is also part of the survey is, what specific types of evergreening practices were included in these training activities? We also had a long list where the respondents chose from. The top three that I'll mention also are water harvesting and soil and water conservation practices. We have other tree planting activities. We have conservation agriculture with trees. And as you can see, out of the 15, we have 13 of our respondents mentioning that they train for water harvesting and soil and water conservation practices. Thank you, Marian. So on to the next question, where it's really a yes and no question. And just to mention that our questions were in different formats. So there was multiple choice. There were part of the questions that you just had to fill in with the list of some of the activities. And we also incorporated yes and no answers. And onto the yes and no one, we have, has your organization provided training for activities aimed at enabling the widespread adoption and accelerating the spread of evergreening practices and landscape restoration? And as you can see in this one, we have 85.7% of our respondents mentioning that yes, they have been enabling and training to enable the widespread adoption and acceleration of evergreening practices. And the 14.3% shows you that we still have a long way to go. It's quite a big number if you consider the fact that this is just a pilot. So you can imagine if it's the wider group in Kenya. So we still have to train and see the needs for capacity building. And we are on to the next question, where we were asking, apart from training on evergreening practices, what types of other training have been provided to enable and support evergreening and landscape restoration? So we have a list also, and just to mention the top three of the other types of training, we have training and assistance for community-based land use, planning, and improved natural resource management. We have training of local trainers to foster peer-to-peer training. And then we have development of tree-based enterprises through value chains. And you can all see that the percentages and the number of respondents and how they responded really to each of the training activities. Thank you, Marian. What are the most common approaches used in the training? So this is where we wanted to find out what kind of approaches they use as they are doing their training. And as you can see, the very top one is visits to demonstration sites. So that seems to work well for most of our organizations that responded. And then we have cross visits, exchange visits, and then we have support to peer and learning amongst lead farmers in the field. As you can see, if you are able to connect all of these top three approaches, all of them have to do with people seeing the work on the ground and learning from the ground and seeing it happening on the ground, which seems to work quite well for the respondents of our survey. Marion? And then we have, what are the most important sources of information for your training programs or content, and approaches on evergreening practices and landscape restoration. This is where we requested our respondents to shortlist their institutions, their websites, the knowledge hubs, or other sources where they get their information for their training programs. And as you can see in this word cloud, training manuals are mostly used for this training programs, where you find that they have online FMNR training manuals. I know World Vision has a manual on that. We have eCraft manuals, we have CalRO, we have ROM, and IUCN materials, which are also used. So just to encourage all of their institutions and organizations that are producing manuals, please continue, because it does seem to be helping our trainers. Who are the main actors targeted by the evergreening trainings? So in this one, I decided to go with the top 4 actors. As you can see, it's a tie between the last 3. And the first one is lower income, smallholder farmers. Those are their main targets. And then we have lead farmers, training of trainers, we have extension workers, and then we have government officials, which is good to know that even government officials are quite represented in these trainings. So you can see 12 of our respondents mentioned that the last 3 are their main actors who they target as they train. And then we have a question on what is the average duration of these training activities offered by your organization. And the biggest percentage, we have 1 to 6 days. So these are trainings which last for almost a week. And then we have trainings that last between 3 to 4 hours, as well as trainings that last from 1 to 2 weeks. Those are the different types of trainings. Depending on the training that they are undergoing, they take that much time. And how many participants are generally involved in these trainings? And you can see at 93.3%, we have 11 to 50%, which shows that quite a lot of people are being trained on evergreening and landscape restoration practices. And this is very good to see that our respondents are doing the work on the ground and they're involved in larger groups. And as mentioned, these trainings are mostly in demonstration sites. So it does really capture quite a big crowd of people. Thank you, Marian. So we also wanted to find out where are these training activities being organized: in a demonstration plot at number 1, in a field or pasture, and then at a school, church, or community center. And all of these places really show why they have such big numbers when they conduct their trainings. Thank you, Marian. So we have another question on which training activities have been the most effective in triggering the widespread adoption of evergreening practices and successful landscape restoration. So they gave us short descriptions, listings, and listing of their training. They are most effective in widespread adoption. And as you can still see, demonstrations are taking the lead. We have exchange visits also, and then we have FMNR restoration approach, which is quite good to see that FMNR is a practice that is really getting spread very widely, and people are being trained on it. Thanks, Maria. So on to the second last question, I think. Would you be able to share documentation about these training activities? And at 73.3%, most of the respondents mentioned that yes, they would be able. And then 26.7% mentioned that no, they would not be able to. And this is a question for all of us. If they are not able to because of protocols or because they are not documenting, and if they are not documenting, how can we now, as the community of organizations, assist or train each other on the importance of documentation of our training and capacity building and trainings, really, which is very important for us to learn from each other. And then to the last question, please confirm if you would like to have access to a repository of training materials on evergreening practices and supporting activities compiled by the Global Evergreening Alliance. And this one shows that people are interested in learning. As you can all see that this is 100% yes. And I think, Marion, that's where my presentation ends. Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Zanele. It was a wonderful presentation. and our thanks for all your efforts and those of the many organizations that have already responded to the survey. But as I think you mentioned, we will be further refining and getting more organizations involved in the survey to further elaborate these results. You know, I found it particularly interesting that the most practiced modalities for training are, in fact, demonstrations and cross visits. And I think that is really significant because, as we all know, seeing is believing, and seeing makes connections, human connections, personal connections with those who are doing it. And that can be guides for launching further restoration activities across communities. So I think that's a particularly interesting thing that we will want to emphasize in our report back to the conference. Great. Now I'd like to turn our attention to our first panel of key individuals to reflect on the results of the survey and how it will be useful in understanding the capacity building needs and how to fill the gaps that are still there. Well, our first panelist is Mr. Francis Nyambariga. Francis is with the Ministry of Agriculture, and we look forward to your comments, Francis, and reflections, given your experience with training and capacity building. Francis, the floor is yours. I think you're on mute. You need to unmute, Francis.
Okay, thank you.
That's good.
I'm sorry for the muting. Now, capacity building is something that has been there for a very long time. To begin with, you'll find that for any technology to take root, there must be an initiator, and there are those to learn from what is happening. Now, in most cases, you'll find that whether it's in a school or in a situation where farmers want to learn, you'll find that they need to see something that is happening somewhere, because sometimes when you find that you're supposed to explain something without maybe observation, it looks abstract. And for a farmer, if you are talking about technology that you are not demonstrating, it is, I think it is a problem to comprehend. That is why you'll find that when the farmers, I mean, when you interview people about the methodology they use to pass information on technologies or new approaches, you'll find that demonstration and even visits come out strongly, because what they see, they will not forget. But what they are just told verbally and there is no practical bit of it, they forget. Now, you're in a situation, in the case of farmers, when we used to have an approach in the name of training and visits, whenever the technical officers in the field will come and see what the farmers are doing, the first thing they could just identify some good farmers, or whenever they are training and they want to see the feedback, they get the feedback from farmers who learn very fast. These are the ones they could identify as maybe contact farmers. The moment the contact farmers are given an opportunity of establishing something, these other farmers come to learn from them. In this case, you may find that maybe an extension officer can demonstrate using a contact farmers field. Secondly, there could be peer-to-peer learning when the farmers really see that this thing is on another farmer's field, and of course he has done well, they'll also follow suit. And of course, even researchers, we used to have, or there is still a branch in research that is called maybe on-farm research. So this on-farm research, the researchers will come to the field, demonstrate on the farmer's field, and then they leave the farmer to continue working. So after some time, they will come back to see whether there is any change, whether there is an adoption. If there is an adoption, other farmers, because it's a demonstration, they will also learn from this other farmer and know that there is no magic about these technologies that have been introduced. So that was a very good area, although it is lacking that was used to gap. Another area that I also find a slight gap in the tool that was used to establish the training needs. You'll find that no provision for age. Maybe you may even find that if the age was involved, then you'll even find that a whole range of maybe responses depending on the age, and then you'll find at what age a technology is likely to be maybe faster than the other, because you'll find that maybe if you involve youth, let's say out of school youth groups, or you can also have 4K clubs in in primary schools, or young farmers in secondary and middle level colleges. Even universities have also young farmer clubs. So that area also, that is where the tool could have also captured something, so that we find out whether there is the youths are involved in this transfer of knowledge or adoption. And then you'll also find that we also missed out slightly on technology. So you'll find that these days, technology has evolved in a way that you can easily you can collect the data using a mobile phone. And then, because where the farmer is answering from, if you develop a very good app, like what we call farm app, it will, the moment you take the coordinates, there is a place where you will tell the farmer, especially if it is a digital form, or a touch screen, it will show where you can capture the coordinates. So it will be very easy to get the information or to carry out a survey very fast from different places, and of course both physically, and of course it will also depend on maybe the timelines, so both the temporal and spatial. And of course there are areas that I also find the tool interesting, in that there is we are talking of farmer managed natural regeneration, and then we have not okay, when it comes to areas of maybe predominantly pastoral areas, we should have also looked for a way of capturing information on the farmers, what do they do, how they are doing, and then the indigenous knowledge. We should have also looked for a way of capturing the indigenous knowledge. I think otherwise, overall, the tool looks effective. The survey was good. And then I can also look at maybe on the survey, the respondents are not 15 as is. they are less than that. They could be around 12 because the Minister of Agriculture is repeated about 4 times. And then we could also have other situations where there is also another organization which is repeated twice, maybe a questionnaire, then maybe I could be one of them. After filling, when the form disappears, when I restart again, instead of now writing the Minister of Agriculture in full, I write with abbreviations, and then it is a double. I mean, it distorts the really picture of the way the information was captured. Thank you. Back to Dennis.
Thank you, Francis. Yes, you're absolutely right. We know these results are quite preliminary, and we hope to expand to quite a number of organizations, get a bigger pool of organizations as we go along. And I think these results will stimulate more organizations to get involved with us. Well, Francis, you also emphasize the importance of demonstrations and seeing to believe. And I think that's a thread that's going through the kind of recommendations that we ought to be focusing on. Well, our second panelist, Oscar Simanto, is unable to be with us today. He was formerly the head of forest extension or on-farm forest extension with the Kenya Forest Service, and is now leader of the Kenya Agroforestry Association. But he couldn't make it today, so I would like to move on to our last panelist in this session, which is Milton Oboka from One Vision in Kenya. Milton, we look forward to your reflections. Over to you.
Thank you very much. First, I would also like to thank the organizer of this event and everyone who has actually made their time to be here with us today. I hope you can see me.
Actually, what we see is we see a background with the sun coming up over the globe. It's beautiful.
It's okay. It's okay. There's a background there. So basically, let me just pick from where you left and from where even Francis left. Seeing is believing. And based on the context of the survey results, you realize that from the objectives, the three top objectives, that is reducing deforestation, rural poverty, and reduction of, reducing the vulnerability to climate change at the community level. So basically, this tells us that for us to achieve our objective when it's come to, evergreening practices or land restoration, we can't ignore actually, community livelihood, because the people will be participating in all these, in the activities, in the initiative. They are human beings and they live at the community level. So for us to achieve all these things, the first question we should be asking, what kind of initiative are we going to do to achieve our objective? And how will the community, in as much as they participate in the process, they also enhance their source of livelihood? Because if we can package our way in which that we address the conservation issues, land restoration issues, whereby the core thing we actually want to see is community being empowered economically, so they own the process and they can buy the idea, so that in as much as they do it, this economic return, something they can see, so and the story they can tell. So it becomes a situation whereby when we also engage the same community to educate others, they have a perspective or something they have experienced in terms of results. Because if I ask you okay, it's true you are doing all these things, but how do you benefit from it? Because that is the big question. And if the community can engage in all these things whereby they get the benefit, at the same time they can tell all this story, you realize that we can as well achieve most of the SDGs, because it is not just a matter of addressing the climate change adaptation and cautioning the community against the vulnerability of climate change, but at the same time making sure that they can have food on their table. So we can address so many issues at the same time. Secondly, you also realize that when it's come to the target groups, whereby who are the target groups in terms of our engagements. And if you check the youth participation, it still falls at 26%. And that is a question we really need to ask ourselves. Why youths are still lagging behind when it's come to restoration issues, probably, I don't know whether it's in Africa or in Kenya, and how do you make youths to be at the forefront when it's come to, advocacy issues, engaging in nature-based enterprises? Maybe what they see probably could not still be enticing to them. And, we deal with a new crop of youths who are enlightened, they know what they want. And sometimes it's also very important, we see how do we package our message so that it is enticing to young people, so we can engage them where they see that this is an initiative I can take, but at the same time, there's something I will be getting by the end of the day. Because if they're young graduates, it will be very, very unfortunate, basically, because it is so not a good thing when you are, you have knowledge, but you have empty pockets. It is a very unfortunate episode somebody can experience as a young graduate. So I think the survey just tells us it is true, youths are still lagging behind in terms of taking this initiative. But as organization or as people work with the community, how do we involve young people to be at the forefront when they are championing for all this initiative? Because they, with their energy, with their zeal, with their knowledge, I believe they are very vital assets when it's come to land restoration activities. And finally, we also realized that this is even Francis talked about, where most of people, when it's come to learning, it's more of the exchange program or sightseeing. So that also tells us at the community level, we really need to engage the community to educate them so that there could be peer learning sort of. Because when you learn from your peer, when you learn from someone from within your community, so you own the process. And it's also very important, you look like you are creating a movement, but at the community level. So they own the process and they feel, I saw it so and so doing the same thing, benefiting. So I can also join them. So based on this, in a summary sort of, the survey is true. We capture very few organizations, but to me, it's a true reflection of what is really going on the ground level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Milton. Excellent points. And I think your emphasis on how the youth can be much more engaged in restoration is certainly a nutty challenge that we need to actually think very deeply about. There are many aspects that we need to work on in order to encourage more participation from the youth and truly make them leaders, as you mentioned. Well, we now have a few minutes for Q&A and discussion with the audience. And may I ask Zanel if you have seen some interesting questions in the chat box or the Q&A box that we might use to start our discussion.
Yes, thank you, Dennis. We have questions. Some have already been answered live on the request for the presentations, and yes, they'll be provided after the webinar. And then there's an anonymous one. I don't know if it's a question. Let me just read it out loud. During the research, were the PLWD put in consideration, since they can have ideas but sit on them, having no one to listen to them, either resources to put into practice?
Mhm.
Dennis or Bob, if you're able to answer.
Maybe Bob, would you want to take a shot at that?
I wasn't 100% clear on the question. Sorry, I didn't see it in the chat. I didn't hear it.
Yeah, maybe you could read it again, Zanel. I was not too clear myself.
Yeah. Okay, so it goes, during the research where the PLWD put into consideration, since they can have ideas but sit on them, having no one to listen to them or either resources to put into practice. Maybe on my side, I'd love to get the clarification for PLWD.
Right. Yeah, I think it's difficult to
People living with
respond.
disabilities. Okay, yeah. People living, thank you, Irene. People living with disabilities, yes.
Okay. All right. So now that we know it's people living with disabilities, could you read it again?
Okay, one more time, Dennis. During the research, were the people living with disabilities put into consideration, since they can have ideas but sit on them, having no one to listen to them or either resources to put into practice?
Can I give it a shot?
Yes, please, Francis.
Yes, I believe that during the survey, maybe if when you are capturing the biodata before you go into the main survey, you need also to get a background check so that you find out if somebody is living with disabilities. So whoever responded, now you may not tell if the document, if the tool was not capturing the disability, then it's not possible to find out that. So I think it was a bit silent on that.
Mhm, mhm. Well, it's interesting bringing that topic up. I think it's something we need to reflect on. You know, what is the potential role of people with disabilities in restoration, and how can they actually get engaged? So let's keep that in mind. Are you having other questions there? Oh, please turn. You're on mute. Yeah. Turn on your microphone.
Sorry about that. So this is a comment and a question, I think. Thank you for the presentation. Most of the smallholder farmers in Kenya have a huge demand for growing high value trees involving fruits, timber, fodder, etc., to increase farm productivity and profitability. I'm surprised from your survey results, there was no training demand registered on capacity improvements on quality tree germplasm and tree nurseries, which support tree growing activities and serve enterprises on their own. I think this is another consideration, Dennis, before I give you to answer, consideration that we can put in mind as we improve the tool.
Exactly. It could be a structural issue with the survey, but but obviously a very important part of capacity building is the nursery development for tree planting. A good point that needs to be emphasized. Right. I see.
Can I take the last one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Give us another one.
Yeah. Peter Kabbles is asking or comments. His comment says there has been a lot of discussion about technology as the focus of training and capacity building. What about social, cultural, and organizational dimensions of capacity building? Bob, would you want to take that one?
Yes, thank you, Peter, for that question. Right, I think we do, get excited about the prospects of making better use of cell phones or remote online courses and things like that. But we do need to be sort of grounded in thinking also about the social, cultural, organizational dimensions, and they can be key, particularly in terms of having the training feeding into grassroots mobilization. We need to be thinking carefully about, what kind of leadership structure are we trying to tap into so that the voices, the people that so help to carry the message that we want to convey through the training capacity building, that they're well respected locally, that they have weight, that people will sort of wake up and pay attention to what's being said. Who is saying it is critically important, and those, if we think carefully about the social and cultural aspects, that'll not only in terms of the weight of the leadership and who's articulating messages, but also who they're connected to and how they'll be spread through networks and through associations within the communities. And similarly, the organizational dimensions are really important. It's great to, if we can, identify how communities are organized, how farmers are organized, what associations exist, and so on, and leverage those organizations that are already in place, as opposed to having the training be an outreach or an extension of a project or a development organization that's external. Just think about how to tap into some of those existing structures that are there, community-based or farmer associations and otherwise. But others may want to say more about that. But thanks for that question and comment, Peter.
Excellent. And, when I think of the social dimensions, I'm reminded that farmer-managed natural regeneration as a restoration practice, or agroforestry on farms, these are practices that individual farm households can deploy. But when you get to forest lands, particularly community forest lands, and to range lands, the whole challenge is community organization and communities being able to manage collectively these resources. And I think this is the great future challenge for restoration, really, is that we have not the capacity with the social skills, the facilitation skills, and the commitments of organizations to do these kind of trainings and to facilitate community management the way that needs to be done. I think this is a real frontier for capacity building in Kenya and all around the world. Great. Well, I think it's about time then that we cut off our discussions. Hopefully we didn't miss too many of the good questions there, but they can come back during the final Q&A after our next session. But I'd like to jump into our second session of panelists who will be giving us their reflections on the challenges and solutions for capacity building. And our first panelist is Ms. Irene Ojok, who has been a veteran of capacity building and extension and project management in land restoration for many years. Irene currently is starting her PhD program with the Right Livelihood College in Bonn, Germany. And so, Irene, it's great that you're able to be with us today, and we look forward to your comments on capacity building.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. And it was nice to hear the discussions earlier on, so I'll just pick it up from there. So I want to give some insights on what I think needs to be properly thought about and considered as we think through and as we deliver capacity building, because that is what translates to action, and that is what gives us the opportunity to see transformation on landscapes. So one is, how do you select the participants for the training? Sometimes we don't think so much about the participants we are training, because these are actually going to be the agents for change on the ground. So whenever you select participants who do not necessarily align with the idea or are able to grasp the issues and relay them back to the larger community, there is a problem. How do you even select the trainer? Because the trainer is the instrument for delivering the information. So whenever you do not have the opportunity to ensure that the trainer has the content required and the content needs to be domesticated to the audience. So we have different capacity needs for different target audiences. You could have communities in the pastoralist context. When you go training land restoration in Marsabit or in Wajir, you do not go with models that do not work within this context. So sometimes when you present training manuals or training approaches that do not apply for context that you get into, you mislead the respondents, and I mean, not the respondents, the participants, and they end up not using the information that you have provided. So then the outcome of the training never sees the light of the day. Another thing is the language barrier. So we have seen from the results that training manuals is really effective, which is good. Most of the practitioners are probably not from the community. How do they translate the manuals to the local communities in their understanding and in a way that marries with their, their context and the issues that affect them? So Zanel presented so well what priorities organizations align to in regards to land restoration. Now the communities equally have their own priorities. So whenever we want to train communities on objectives, do we disassociate the objectives from our own interests and ensure that these interests are actually theirs or they own the objectives? I'll give an example. So I go into a community and I want to train on, let's say, FMNR. Why FMNR? Is it really necessary for this household to adopt it? Now, if the household does not understand why, the household may listen to you and try to do it because probably you really tried to promote it, but because this household did not own the approach, did not believe in it, did not find it solving the problem that really links with the challenges around this household, then it only becomes your own business and not their business. So how do we make this business of land restoration move away from the global priorities to local issues that communities can champion for without necessarily getting too much pressure from above? So then it becomes their own issue and they can actually set targets for these issues. They can find innovative ways to train themselves. Another thing is about networks. So there's a lot of push for forming groups, forming associations that are aligned to different priorities. Sometimes they bring confusion. I would recommend as much as possible that we work within the existing structures, because when we form so many networks, so many associations, then it becomes very difficult to sustain them. When the communities are able to find the objectives of a capacity building session fitting within their needs, then they are able to integrate it. So when they integrate it, it's easy to run or work with them within those priorities and still achieve the deliverables. So let's move away from creating so many networks, so many associations, and try and strengthen the existing groups, existing networks, existing associations, and ensure we help them develop priorities that align with the issues that affect them and ensure that the capacity building gaps and needs are actually worked on even within the local settings. The other thing is the digital world we are into, and COVID is even going to make this challenge greater. So right now, trainings are 3/4 virtual. What is happening in the deeper Elgeyo Marakwet community? What is happening in the deeper Masai Mara context? These people do not have the opportunity or pleasure to get into Zoom meetings like we are here today. COVID is really, becoming worse in Kenya. How are we going to ensure that even within this kind of challenging issues, how do we ensure that we still have a comfortable way to ensure capacity building is ongoing? Because capacity building is an ongoing process. It does not stop by one training or two. We need to ensure more follow-ups. We need to ensure that the mode of delivery of the messages are actually adaptable to the audience that we are targeting. So we need to look for innovations, creativity, and approaches that are going to fit within this digital world, but more importantly, ensure that the grassroots are more empowered and more engaged and frequently monitored. People do not, once you have taken me for an exposure, then you forget about that meeting. Probably I will go start doing something and just leave. But if we continue engaging, we do more follow-ups, we ask ourselves whether the training was impactful or not, it helps the communities, it helps even partners, it helps governments to be able to put each other on track, especially on targets, on deliverables for capacity building. Some key steps I would want to mention for us, because I know majority of the participants here, mainly either practitioners in government, in organizations, is whenever you want to do capacity building, please ask yourself some fundamental questions. What is the training about? Why are you training? Why exactly do you have to do this training? And take a lot of time to think about it. And once you understand this, then who are you training? So who are you training allows you to now be able to move into the context of gender issues, the youth issues, the disability issues, and then you are able to segregate your participants to ensure that the people you are targeting are actually going to help you achieve your objectives, and you do not exclude other members of the community. So integration, inclusion is very fundamental whenever you're thinking about who you're going to train and how are you going to train. Not all approaches work for different participants. The how is a very fundamental question because it helps you define how you're going to deliver this content. It helps you define the participants better and allocate them and fix them in the right place and ensure that the mode you are going to use will work for them. The next thing is when and where. So when you know that you are missing on women, especially in the trainings you have been having, the question could be, maybe the time you're training is not fitting best for women. Do you have to restructure your training approach so that you're able to target and reach them? Where are you going to do this training? Sometimes, and unfortunately, I will say this, we are under pressure to spend money because you need to run activities very fast. You are accounting to donors. So you end up taking people to hotels, 5 days training, and this is really a practical training that needs to be done on the farm. So because you are under pressure of spending, you end up, taking 5 days, running through a whole training, and you think now you have lead farmers well trained on this model, and you forget about that training. You're looking for the next activity. It's very important to ensure that the place, the when is answered and thought through to ensure that the training is more effective, it's more efficient, and it's actually going to deliver on the mandates. Lastly, you have to now evaluate whether this training was meaningful, was it achievable, and let's learn to unlearn. Training or capacity building is not one-sided. So don't think that as a practitioner, as an expert, you know everything. Farmers may know more than we do, and they surely know a lot of things because they're the ones who apply these things. Let us learn to unlearn. When you try something and it doesn't work, go back and have a conversation. Let the farmers tell you this didn't work and this is how probably it should work. And then you redesign and plan and train in the best way possible to ensure that it's more effective. Yeah, thank you so much, Dennis, for the time.
Well, Irene, those comments clearly indicate how deep your thoughts and experience have been with training and capacity building. I hope we've been able to capture all of those points because they're absolutely golden. Thank you so much. Thank you. And now let us call on Teresa Gitonga to join us with her reflections Teresa joins us from the International Tree Foundation. Teresa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for this opportunity. It's interesting to talk after Irene have talked, because like she have covered most of the things about those specific challenges in terms of capacity building. So that I'll take from where she have been able to lead. In terms of capacity building, it's very important to value the community contribution. A lot of people, I have seen people going with the ready-made presentations. They go with the ready-made presentation. The presentation they are using for the community is the same presentation they use for the leads, the CEOs, the same presentation to the government institutions. I think it is very important for to be able to value the knowledge that communities have. I want to give an example. Right now, I am in Mount Kenya region, whereby we are training the communities on the threatened tree species, so that we integrate them in landscape restoration. And it is very interesting that the communities themselves understand the trees that are already threatened, and they are able even to locate the few remaining. Yesterday, we had a very interesting time locating some of the few remaining species in the forest. So the communities know more than the people who are coming in. Number two, when we are doing, there is inadequate partnership and collaboration. There are sometimes you will find people, I have seen people, maybe I train on a nursery establishment to the communities. Another organization which should be complementing that specific training, then come and do the same capacity building to the Community Forest Association. You train them on a nursery establishment, threatened tree species. I think the best thing is to think about how can we be able to complement each other in the terms of the work that we are doing? How can we do more together? Because we'll be able to achieve more if we complement each other. But if we duplicate each other, like I want to do this, as Irene have said, you want to make sure that the money is used. You can't be able to sit down and think and say, let us do this. If you do the capacity building, we are going to do the planting of 50,000 threatened species. Why don't you come up and say that I will be able to add 10,000 threatened species in different counties, because there is already a lot of threatened species in Kenya. That is just for example. Another thing that we have recognized, realized when we are doing the capacity building, there's still low participation of women in terms of capacity build, in terms of the capacity building forums. And we have realized that we are looking at what are the root causes that are making the women not to participate. You will realize in some cases the women are in there in the meetings, but they are not contributing. They are not talking. So that means their priorities, their knowledge is not captured, their priorities is not captured, the needs of those women are not captured. So we need to know what are the root causes, and this we discuss with the communities so that at least even men understand what is the root cause of women not coming to such community activities or decision-making activities. One may be the issue, of a lot of work, a lot of workload. Yesterday, I've met a lot of women going to the forest, about 5 kilometers going to the forest to look for fuel wood. So by the time that woman come back, they will not be able to participate. I have seen some of the women, you invite them to meetings, but the people who represent them is their husbands. Are we going to be able to capture the needs and priorities of this half of the population of the world? Because the women population is a half of the world. So we need to capture their needs. We need to capture their priorities. Another thing that we have been able to see as a challenge is that a lot of apps have been developed to do the monitoring evaluation But what happens is that you are taken to the same community. So if you introduce all those apps and you have not trained the communities how to use those apps, some of them are so complicated even to use. Some of them can be integrated because some are correcting only the ecological data. Maybe they are not correcting the socio-economic data. So if we can be able to have a forum as all partners whereby we can come up with all those apps and find a good app that can be able to be integrated to reduce kind of duplication and making them simple in a language that the communities can be able to understand. Another thing is keeping the community in class. I liked the presentation on the survey because demonstrations are very, very important. I have realized that these communities will understand more when they are doing it practically. It is not when they are leading the theory in class you are presenting, and in a language that they are able to understand. We talk about large-scale restoration. It looks like a very big thing or big words, but it is just something that communities are supposed to do on the ground and can be explained in a very simplified words. So I think those are some of the points maybe which were not mentioned and by Irene, and thank you so much, Dennis.
Well, thank you, Teresa. I think your comments and your proposals were very complementary to what Irene shared with us and very, very useful as we look at our action plans, and particularly that emphasis on how do we collaborate so that we can reduce duplication and improve effectiveness. Well, our third panelist is our colleague Charles Odhiambo from World Vision Kenya. And Charles, could you add further to Irene and Teresa's remarks with some reflections on what you think is important for our ability to build collaboration and training? Charles, can you unmute? Or maybe you're stuck. Yeah, it looks like. Oh,
thank
Charles,
you so much, Dennis.
Yes.
Maris, yes.
We can hear you now.
Let me remove the. I'm there. Am I audible? Yes, Irene and Teresa, for what you have shared. I think most of the issues they have captured, but I think it is also important that we look at what the donor wants. Sometimes the donor forces us to do proposals in areas that may not even be complementary to what the local community needs are. And sometimes the funding available also limits the extent to which we can go insofar as training. So we may assume that the people we train are going to pass on the information for attitude change, for behavior change, as well as also for practice change, and that may not be the case. When it comes also to what you are saying about networking, it's also good to note before you network, who is doing where, how is he doing it, the budgets. What for the case of the donor requirement, but the impact might not be there, and choose the people to be trained at times, and which now leads to low adoption. And sometimes because the donor requirement is within a timeline and land restoration takes time, we quickly think of collaboration. Sometimes I think there's need for increased partnerships, especially with the research institutions for on-farm demonstrations rather than on-station demonstrations. Farmer field schools and field schools of each of the partners that we have on board. If, for example, you identify of media, then you think of which is the best media fraternity to bring on board, because the media play a critical role in sharing our successes. If you look at some of the trends today, and so you may look at, yes, how do we bring a partner who will support in review of this curriculum in terms of the key government players need to come on, and probably who is best placed to communicate this idea to them. If it comes from us, it may not add much value, but if it comes from the pastoralists, the agro-pastoralists, so some of these are critical considerations we need to look at, even as we lobby for more funding. And we need to look at our nature, the nature of our societies. If our societies are patriarchal, then we need to find out how best do we deal with that. Maybe we need to partner with the community elders, like let's say in the elders, and talk to them to be able to address or help us to address that instead of us tackling it directly ourselves. Now, if there are socio-cultural impediments to adoption, maybe you train women, but women, when they go back, their husbands will not allow them to put into practice that which they were trained on. Then you need to involve more men in the training so that the men will understand why the women are pushing towards a certain direction. And then generally, there's an observation that sometimes, like Karen was putting it, we could put a training in an hotel, and the people targeting are women, and the women will not, you end up with only a third or less of the target audience turning up. So we need to look at how best do we enhance our capacity building at the local community level and ensure that we involve everyone. Like Teresias mentioned, women involvement is low. Zanelle's presentation also highlighted that youth representative participation, who to look for as a youth-led group that can support us to bring more youth on board. Do we look at more? Is it if we bring some entertainment, some social media work through Twitter, through WhatsApp, and all that kind of thing? So it is very important that in doing this, we look at the strategic partners that we want to involve. Who are they? What are they doing? Where are they working? How are they working? What strategies are they using? What is the desired impact applicable to this context? Can we more add value to what, that which already? I'm going to stop there because insight had been brought in and here, and I think this is very insight. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Charles. Sorry you were breaking up a little bit there towards the end, but I think we got most of the key messages that you shared, and they were in fact very complimentary to our other panelists. Well, we're going to wind up our session with a reflection from Mr. Gideon Osoti, who is the director for Kenya of Trees for the Future, an organization that is doing a lot of restoration work in various countries in Africa. Gideon, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Dennis. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you so much. As you have correctly said, I'm Gideon from Trees for the Future. Thank you so much, fellow presenters, that is Charles, Irene, and Teresia, and all the rest who had presented before. I also want to echo your sentiments by adding a few notes here. Well, the restoration of trees and forests in tropical landscapes is recognized as a global priority to address the widespread decline in the quality, productivity, and resilience of ecosystems, and to maintain services that support biodiversity, and also to mitigate climate change and promote human well-being. In this discussion here today, forest landscape restoration would encompass a broad set of strategies and approaches for increasing tree and forest cover in deforested or degraded landscapes and balancing different goals and socio-economic values. And that is very, very important. Now, the forest landscape restoration includes a range of interventions outside and within forests, such as agroforestry, which we are doing currently, natural regeneration, planted forests, silviculture, improved fallows, watershed protection, and erosion control. There are quite a number. Therefore, capacity building or capacity development is an important component to advance and scale up forest
Oh, we seem to have lost Gideon. Zanel, we lost him, and
Yes,
Charles is breaking up also. Gideon seems to have dropped out. Okay, well, maybe what we'll do is carry on, and if he was able to get back online, we'll have him take the floor once again. Okay. Well, at this point, we wanted to, again, open up the discussions. And Zanel, in your evaluation of the Q&A and the chat box, have you identified any further questions that would be interesting to discuss today?
Yes, thank you so much, Dennis. And I think we have an interesting one here. And I can see Irene has already responded on the Q&A. And what strategies do you want to employ in order to reach out to the interior communities in rural areas which are involved in greening activities in Kenya?
Well, let us ask Irene to respond to that. That would be excellent.
Yeah, so I just responded, you need to go to the ground. I think that's the number one thing you have to do. You cannot address an issue from the farthest distance because you don't even understand the context. You must understand the context to be able to provide what is necessary. So go to the ground, understand the people, understand where they're coming from, what do they need, and contextualize what they need with the opportunities that are available. Number two, it's also important that you look at the opportunities to train. There are different methods that can work for different contexts. So Charles just mentioned the social media, and not social media, the media. Yeah, so the radios, you can still pass messages through radio so that when people hear something so many times, it sticks in their heads. There's the opportunity for demonstrations, there's the opportunity for dialogue. You don't have to do the lecture method. Have talks with people. Let people reflect about the past. What used to happen in our context? What did we do to make us get to where we are? What can we do to address the issues that have made us get to where we are today? And capacity building actually needs to be effective. It must be efficient. It needs to be adaptive and be transformative for it to be able to catalyze change so that mindsets, because the biggest enemy we have is here. Our minds are actually our biggest enemy for change. So if our capacity building sessions never change our minds to take action, then we will continue talking about capacity building forever. When you go into a community, think about exit. Think about you getting out at the beginning. Gideon is back.
Gideon's back?
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Are you finished with your comment, Irene? It was very good, very good. Go to ground, very clear. So
Yes.
yes, Gideon, you are back. Would you like to complete your remarks?
Yes, I want to complete by saying the following. In the areas where we work, there are quite a number of challenges about capacity building. One is gender differences and inequalities with respect to control over land and productive resources. This includes decision-making power, resource use, and off-farm labor. While landowners possess formal title deeds to varying extents, men make up a significant majority of those landowners, and they are the key decision makers, despite women being equally or significantly more engaged in farming labor than men. Then something else is that some discrepancies between formal legislation and customary practice. For instance, women lose their rights to inherit ancestral land upon marriage. And in some cases, women and girls can only inherit family land in instances where there are no boys or men in the family. And also, you also come across parents who are hesitant towards transferring land titles to the youth. Their worry would be that land might be lost if used as collateral for loans that those youths are unable to repay. So all these and many more have implications for restoration, as insecure rights can limit the perceived security of access to future benefits and hence disincentivize in activities like tree planting. So you go to a community with the tree campaign, and then you are unable to bring the youths on board because they don't see as this is going to help them in the future. Then, of course, the time span, we have a project time of engagement. Sometimes it's usually shorter. And forest landscape restoration is usually a long-term thing. It cannot be done over a period of time. So it requires a lot of time for that to be accomplished. Sometimes the cost, as perceived by those landowners, the cost of restoration, sometimes they are viewed as very huge. And so farmers think that they are not going to gain so much, because in their context, what they need is just food on the table, So this will discourage the owner of the land from undertaking a restoration, even though this is a very, very viable activity. We are also experiencing aging population of smallholder farmers. The younger generation, really, they don't click. And this has been said by many other presenters here. They don't click with farming and environmental matters, even though it is of more benefit to them. So, and those of them who are willing to attempt may not have ownership rights on the land. So this is also a very big challenge. You train the youths, and they want to go and look for jobs in towns, and so they carry on with them that training, and sometimes it's not left behind here. And then something that should also be checked, even as we plan for this, is the gap between production and profit from farming ventures. This is real and seriously demotivates farmers. There is need to address production of quality produce, you address consumption, and most importantly, you address the marketing part of it, so that the package of land restoration is complete. In conclusion, key challenges in capacity building would include a lack of standard indicators and evaluation of capacity building, and that is where now we are doing it at the national level before it's brought down. A continuing lack of understanding regarding the definition and scope of capacity building as a field and as an approach, that is very key. A lack of local ownership and also limited uptake of tools, which affects the implementation of capacity building programs. And so for capacity building to be effective, it should be subjected to rigorous monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. This is very, very key. You monitor, you evaluate, and a report is given. And then capacity building should also be participatory. It should be based on the needs of both the organization and the communities where the implementation is going to take place, and should focus on sustainability. Many a times we could be going to the ground, and because we want to achieve a short-term thing, so we just do that work there because there is a particular thing that we want to achieve, and we forget about the impact that is going to leave on the communities. And then capacity building must also make tools and approaches available and adaptable, and must be recognized as fundamental to all development interventions. I think all those recommendations should help us and any other individual organizations or donors to implement capacity, local forest land restoration efforts. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gideon. I think your comments really rounded out our discussion today, looking at some of the issues with regard to land rights, land tenure, aging populations, and some of the dynamics of communities that are so important. So we've completed our panel discussion, and I'd like to turn back to Zanel. I think we have a few points in the Q&A box, and perhaps you'd like to read out the question from the top from Jane from UNEP.
Thank you, Dennis. I was hoping we could round up with
Yes.
the comment. Sorry, I'm trying to find Jane's comments, but let me just go through Moses and Jua's comment.
Yeah, she was asking, how can donors capture the priorities of the local communities? And I think that that actually was a reaction to what was said a little earlier, that sometimes it's difficult to balance what donors want with what the communities want, and that is a give and take. And so obviously, my response to that would be that donors need to be educated by the proponents who are involved in restoration and have the experience in restoration, so that they can have adequate flexibility in their assumptions about what they want out of a project. Because as Irene mentioned, when you get to ground, you're looking at the actual needs of the people out there, and those have to be consistent with your restoration objectives. It's absolutely important. Yes, I guess we are probably running out of time. Is that right, Zanel? It looks like we just have a few minutes left. We wanted to finish about 5:45. So maybe I would, I just wonder, are there any other questions that have particularly interesting for response from our panelists?
Not a question, Dennis, but an emphasis of bringing together our efforts. And there's just a comment on the problem with multiplicity. And we have a lot of organizations doing different things, but we need to have to be very deliberate on the efforts of bringing them together. So I think that's the most emphasized point from all the participants on the comments on the chat, bringing all the efforts together. And I'm hoping that with this webinar and the conference, we'll be able to achieve this. And maybe, Dennis, you can just give us the remarks from the conference and what we aim really for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Zanel. Yes, to wrap up in just a couple of minutes, I tried to record some of the key points that came up, with particular emphasis from our speakers, the results of the survey, and the panelists. And it's a very rich harvest. I won't even try to go through all of these points that came up, but there were some very, very important and emphatic points that are important for the development of our message to the national conference and the development of an action plan. And I guess I would just emphasize, as I believe Teresa in particular emphasized, the importance of developing a plan of action in capacity building that brings the organizations together. It tries to effectively avoid duplication, but rather synergy, and is a mechanism by which we can really institute collaboration in training, collaboration in the design of training, and the allocation of responsibilities. And if we use the process and the principle of seeing is believing, we can emphasize in the action plan organizations coming together to have cross visits and joint demonstrations, so that they can in fact learn from each other and develop their own internal training more effectively. And of course, capturing the needs of the communities is the basis for our approaches for restoration. So what we will do now is we will actually refine the notes of all of the points made by our speakers and our panelists. We'll prepare a presentation to the conference with an emphasis on how the conference can take it up and develop an action plan for collaborative action in training and capacity building among the increasing number of organizations that are getting involved in restoration across the Kenya landscape. So that, I think, will be our emphasis during the conference. And I would like just now to really thank all of the thoughtful contributions of our speakers, our panelists, and our supporters in terms of the communications, the logistics for this webinar, and also for all of the participants. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you'll be with us for the conference that will be coming up in the 9th to the 16th of July, and we'll be able to join us and participate in all of the sessions of the conference, but particularly, of course, our session that will emphasize the outcomes of this webinar. So thank you once again, and look forward to seeing you at the Kenya National Landscape Restoration Scaling Up Conference beginning on the 9th of July. Thanks again. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Dennis.